Welcome to Northern Lights and Insights. My name is Bob Rohlf, and my guest today is Senator Gene McCarthy. Gene McCarthy is a native Minnesotan, and many of you know him from his days of political activity in the state. He started out really, when I first met him, he was a professor at the College of St. Thomas, where I was able to matriculate. And he went on from the College of St. Thomas to be elected to the United States House of Representatives. Shortly after that, he was elected to the United States Senate, where he served 2 terms. He's a prolific author. He's considered to be a statesman in the Democratic Party. And I think what most of us remember most for is the fact that Gene McCarthy, then a representative, stood up against the infamous or famous Senator McCarthy from Wisconsin and was the first public politician to confront him for his ideas about communists in every nook and cranny in the United States government. For that, most of us, I think, are eternally grateful. I certainly am. Senator McCarthy went on to become a candidate for president. And some years after he challenged Senator McCarthy from Wisconsin, he himself was challenging the President of the United States, essentially on the Vietnam War. And he became, in effect, the standard bearer for many people in their opposition to that war. He's had a distinguished career as a lecturer, professor, and an author. And today we're here to talk about his newest work called A Colony of the World. Senator McCarthy, you've written a lot of books, and this one has started some controversy different than I've heard in the past about you. And I'm going to quote from some of the things I read in the other comments. You claim in the book the United States is now a colonial relationship, perhaps better labeled as a neo-colonial relationship, not to one country, but to a combination of outside forces, political, economic, and ideologic. That's very different for the United States, who started out, we started out as a colonial country. And you say in your, I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights and then ask you to take it from there, if you would. You say that the United States, in effect, has lost our control over foreign and military policy. You also say in your book that the second mark of our colonial dependence is a lack of control over our own borders, either as defined or mapped. Then you go on also to say in another part of the book that we've lost our economic freedom and we've become an economic colonial country because major investments in a colony are made by a mother country or by citizens of another country. And then you go on to talk about colonialism as imposition of a mother country's culture on the colony or dependent society, and you get into the whole question of language and religion. Now, those are 4 very interesting points you make, and I think we could go on them, and I'd like to start with the first one because it's been the one that, in my generation, I think bothered us so much, the so-called military-industrial complex.
Well, I think my treatise in the history of the military-industrial complex is probably the best one that's been written, you said modestly.
Yes.
And the thesis, of course, was that almost every country is a colony now. You don't really know who the mother country is anymore, but we didn't think we were. But I wrote a book in '67 called The Limits of Power, which sort of anticipated this, that we were in a different world and the power relationships were changed. The Russians were still a force, but the military-industrial complex is just one of the forces that impinge upon policy because it's such a dominant force and power in the economy, but also as a world force. And I developed the history of it because it came on, you get to thinking that the Pentagon and the military stuff just happens, but it doesn't. They think down there. Not all good. But in '47, they changed the name of the War Department to the Defense Department, which was, I thought, a real signal. I didn't know it was then, but as I look back, because if you have a War Department, somebody says, "Where's the war?" Or you have one planned. But if you say, "This is the Defense Department," you say, "Where's the danger?" They say, "It's everywhere." And they moved on through the consolidation of industry and the Defense Department, and the final act was really to establish the so-called volunteer army. And I opposed that. It happened after I left the Senate, but de Tocqueville and Jefferson, all of them said we have to have a citizens' army. And it's not in the book, but I think as we watch developments relative to Desert Storm and some of the recent things with the military on even the gays and some of these other developments about the Marine Corps, that you have a kind of different response from the military now than you did when it was a volunteer, when it was a draft army. So we have to see what develops. But in any case, that's a part of that first chapter. But I was saying about Joe McCarthy, you know, we kind of grew up here in college. We always had the socialist workers, the socialist labor party. They weren't very effective. We got to, I think, thinking that communists were not as dangerous as some other people thought they were. And at the university, you kind of knew the communist kids, that they were the ones that weren't really smart, but they were kind of on the edge, you know, and they wanted to have a total answer for everything. And we knew some, I knew some of them when I was in graduate school. And I remember one was cited, and another was a woman I knew was teaching at St. Thomas, or Catherine's, and she'd been with him. She said, if his name was, I forgot his last name, she said, if Haldor is the communist threat, she said, we have nothing to worry about.
Right. Yeah. You make the comment in your book, and this was something I hadn't thought about before, that before World War II, that most of the armaments, tanks, for example, and Navy ships, were built in government-owned companies.
Facilities, that's
Facilities,
right.
the
Yeah.
Navy yards or the arsenals.
Yeah, Navy
and
yards.
that changed
arsenal.
at World War II, and we never went back to that again.
Not, it's kind of interesting now as they're cutting down on some of the contracts and so on, that some of the industrial people are complaining that the military are putting their stuff back in what were originally the old arsenals and so on. So they're kind of going back to where they were as they. But logistics was a major force in World War II, and the Army couldn't produce enough tanks. You had to go to General Motors. And there weren't any, you know, the military didn't have any airplane factories. So the connection between the Air Force and the industrial complex is much more intense than in the other two forces because of the history.
Sure. So you were saying in that very important period, or what has now become the very important period right after World War II, a major change took place. The private companies took over our,
That's right.
in effect, our building of guns.
Yeah.
And,
in 49-50, first 2 years I was in 50 and 51, I guess it was, we cut the defense budget to $15 billion. And then came the Korean War. But they hadn't put the military-industrial thing into place. But after Korea, well, the defense budget went up to about 50 billion. It never came down. 100, 200, 300. It's still operating.
well, in your book, The Colony of the World, you also make the statement that about foreign policy, and you seem to label John Foster Dulles as the architect of a major change, in that all of a sudden presidents started to be reacting to foreign countries' policies rather than that kind of clear, decisive policy we had our own, and everybody just went from there.
Yeah, he moved. Truman was anti-communist, but it was particular communists. It was, you know, Russians or Turks, whatever they might be. But Dulles, when he got done, you had to be against any kind of a communist. If it didn't have any historical, it had to be. It was ideological then, and that sort of was laid on us. And I cite particularly in the case of Vietnam, you had most all of these forces impinging to practically force Kennedy and following him Nixon to fight a war in Vietnam.
Yeah. Didn't Dean Rusk kind of continue the same thing, though?
Well, Rusk drew some lines. You remember the speech he got in trouble with when he said the defense perimeter does not include Korea. That Rusk, I don't mean Rusk, I'm sorry, Atchison drew the line, and he said this is a communist country. It wasn't just communism in general. But Rusk was a follower of Dulles. I said he was sort of the Cromwell to Calvin.
Oh, my.
Oh, you like
All
that?
right.
We Irish
Yes,
understand
that's right.
that. But I mean, Cromwell laid out Calvin laid out the ideology, and Cromwell took up arms. And Rusk was much more militant. And it bothers me a little that Dulles sort of begot Rusk, and Rusk begot Vance, what's his name, Cyrus Vance.
Cyrus Vance.
And they said Cyrus Vance begot Christopher.
Oh,
So
I hadn't
you've
made
got
that
a
connection.
direct
but-
line, yeah. And so I'm pretty anxious when I watch. There's a line in foreign policy. They never invite me into things like the Trilateral Commission, you know, and the Foreign Affairs. And I feel left out. I mean, Jimmy Carter was in, Clinton was in. I think Walter Mondale was a trilateral. They bring you in and sort of say, you know, this is the inner ring.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we see things more clearly than other people, and but they never asked me to join the trilaterals, and I suspect any organization that doesn't invite me in.
Well, wouldn't it be true, though, that unlike the others that you've named, you challenged the president, and you challenged
Well,
the
that's right.
incumbency?
Not just the
and
president, but this whole line of thought.
That's right.
Yeah.
So in that, you become somebody that they don't necessarily want to invite to dinner, so to speak.
Yeah, you make you uneasy. You're like Lazarus. Come back. They say, "What are you doing here, Lazarus? We thought we'd gotten rid of you."
You raised some interesting books interesting books. You raised some interesting points in your book on the Persian Gulf, and that jumps us quite a few years ahead. But I'm going to read some of these questions and ask if you would comment on some of them. You'd say, for example, why was the advice of military experts, of those reputed to be experts, such as former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, retired Admiral Crowe, ignored? Or why were the military forces of the Arab nations aligned against Iraq not asked, urged, or assisted to assume the major military responsibilities in the war? Those are two questions a lot of Americans ask and nobody's ever answered.
That's right. I first raised those questions in a speech at St. Catherine's College when it was just beginning to develop. And particularly after the action was over, I thought that the Arabs should have been really in a position where there was pressure on them to go in and occupy major parts of Iraq. But again, it's the old establishment thing that, you know, those lines were drawn. I say it in the book that those maps were drawn by the British in 1922 and by the oil companies.
Right.
We were involved, and you know, Iran was our cut, you know, and Saudi Arabia, Aramco, Saudi American and Arab oil companies.
Arab American Oil Company.
Yeah,
I think is
and the French had pretty much Iraq, you know, and the British got all those emirates that they set up, Kuwait, and so I think I say that part of the colonialism, at least in a very narrow way, was the British sort of got us to defend their map makers. This is always a mark of imperial power. You start drawing maps. And we may have to do some maps if we break out of this colonial disposition we're in now.
I'm going to digress a little bit, but the Russians did a pretty good job of redrawing maps, didn't they?
Well, they did, and it was really kind of recognized in Helsinki. The Helsinki Accords that went forward. I always thought the Helsinki Accords were never given the amount of attention that they should have been given. But the Russians drew maps and drew lines, and they included Yugoslavia. We should know about Yugoslavia. Right. If you've watched politics on the Iron Range here, why, you can't be too surprised at what's happened.
And not only redrew maps they did, but the other Western countries did. They renamed things.
That's right. Yeah.
And now the Russians are back renaming them again, or
taking down the old
statues
and, you know, recognizing the old lines in some places.
You also raised the question in your book about the whole problem we have of energy, and you say, why is no effort being made now to establish an energy program for the United States? If the war was partly, I think, in our own self-interest because of the oil question, why don't we have an energy program?
Well, I think that the one real immediate justification for it was oil. The oil, we're under contract, more or less, to protect oil supplies for Western Europe and also for Japan under the treaties after World War II. And this was a real threat, and to protect the lifelines to vital resources. But when they got beyond Saudi Arabia, they were not protecting oil that we necessarily needed. I mean, there's plenty coming from Saudi Arabia, so it raised an altogether different set of questions, I thought. And, but also the question of why weren't we in a better position so as not to be so dependent on them.
You didn't raise a question in the book, but I suspect you and the other circles you travel in, the question has been raised. Since we seem to be protecting oil for Japan in that war, why wasn't Japan involved?
Well, I guess they really don't have any military.
But they do have money.
They sent some money, but it wasn't very much. And it raised another question, which I don't have in this book. I raised in another book, that once the Japanese, and all this stuff about trade advantage, the real advantage the Germans and the Japanese have had has been we're spending $200 to $300 billion on defense, which is really counterproductive in terms of ordinary economic competition. They were spending, I don't know how it varied some, but between the two of them would be probably 60 to 80 billion. So there's a $200 billion roughly difference we were spending. And half of that at least was in their defense. And I've been advocating since the mid-70s when these two economies recovered and the balance of trade turned against us. We really should have moved at that point to say, look, we're going to impose an import duty on everything you send in the name of defense. But they should have been, if you're specific about it, they should have been paying about half of our defense bill since the end of World War II. Partly because they were responsible for creating some of it, but also because their economies had recovered, and we should have expected them to pay more than we did.
Well, it's certainly been controversial, whatever role they've played. But
well, this differential is really bears more upon than these arguments you get about the Japanese won't buy soybeans from us, they won't buy rice, and they have a ban on aluminum bats made in America on the grounds that they don't have quality control, you know.
No, I didn't know that one. Well, I'd like to change quite a bit and go to the chapter on your book, or chapters which really dealt with immigration and our borders and the issue you make about we've lost control of our borders. And I'm going to read just a few phrases from here, and as you know, they have become rather controversial. You say there are 4 major areas in which effective action is possible and necessary if the United States is to deal with immigration problems. First, the flow of illegal immigration should be stopped. Second, you say, as a part of the enforcement programs, employer sanctions should be vigorously pursued. Third, you say action should be taken to encourage countries from which the illegal immigrants come to stop or discourage immigration and to help establish viable economies which will relieve the pressures on their people to attempt the illegal entry. And last, you say that laws bearing on legal immigration should be changed to give the United States more control over both the numbers and quality of immigrants. Now, those issues, I think, have all been attacked by one group or another, saying that all of a sudden, why should the United States change its centuries-old immigration policy?
Well, it isn't really that old, you know. We changed the law. I was in Congress in '65. It was a proper change. I supported it. We got away from the old quotas that had been established about 1890 or 96, which were largely to discriminate against almost total elimination of Orientals.
Right.
And pretty much limited just to, and also against even Southern Europe, and of course the Hispanics weren't involved. And this was to really make it more open and honest and modernize it. But then they got into the automatic things they got into were two things. One, they later on really, they wrote in these provisions saying that certain family relationships and increase in population or illegal aliens born in the United States, so that the numbers that come in legally under these rather, I think, improper laws are 200,000 or 300,000 a year, depending on the year. And then the other thing we did was to create these political exiles because of a lot of silly military things, but it got so they said we're on your side, and we can't, you know, we're in danger at home. You got to take us in. And then Carter invited the Cubans to send them in, you know. And so Castro said, "I'll give you a boatload that you won't forget."
and we haven't forgotten them either.
That's right.
I don't think.
And so there are two problems. One is the law itself, and I see Clinton is now talking about more border people. I think we need, you know, we've been in greater danger the last 20 years from border crossings, not just people but drugs, and from any kind of external threats to us. And we still try to control that with the border patrols and the drug people. And I think we ought to have something like the Coast Guard, but not at sea. Probably 200,000 or 300,000 forces. And this would be a good time to organize it because you got the people coming out of the military. But it's not going to happen, although Clinton is talking now about, but most of his measures are kind of halfway. You know, we're going to do more than has been done. You say, well, that's good. But it's really not enough.
Not enough.
like we're going to do more to cut the deficit than's been done. The deficit now is like talking about plutonium. You say, what's the half-life of the deficit? What's the half-life of the national debt? I think, according to the simple mathematics, it's about 2,000 years now.
Yeah.
Whereas the half-life of the deficit is about 20. But you have to agree that, you know, it's better to do something than nothing, but not much better.
This spring I had the opportunity to visit New York, and my wife and I went out to the Ellis Island Museum, and I must admit that despite my interest in American history, and I was a history major in college, I found out that even in the period before World War I, the United States did have some tough immigration restrictions.
Oh, they had.
They sent a lot of people back.
That's right.
With tears, and I'm sure.
Criminal records and health.
That's right, their health. If they didn't pass certain health tests, back they went.
Yeah.
If they were suspect, whatever that meant.
Some of them even got sick coming over, and
That's
they'd turn
right.
around and send them back. Yeah, this thing about, and this kind of vision of the melting pot thing, you know, is a kind of a deception.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, they didn't take everybody in, but I did a book on de Tocqueville, America, and it's called America Revisited, back in 1981. But he came over, his cover for the junket was that he was going to study prisons in America.
Mm-hmm.
Because we were into reform, you know, the religious people had moved into prison design, and the French didn't try to reform a criminal, they just sent him to Devil's Island and said, you get over it yourself, or some other place. And they came to study to see whether these reforms were having any effect on prisoners. They were going to take it back to France, so they didn't find out much. But in one of his reports, and they covered about 6 or 7 northern prisons, Philadelphia, Auburn, and Sing Sing, and I think Danbury. Anyway, they didn't include the South, which still had slavery. And the percentage of what they called blacks, runaway slaves, and Hispanics was about the same in the prisons then as it is now.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't begun to assimilate them, and we weren't assimilating them then. And you just have to say, well, it's too bad. It's not a credit to us, but it's a reality.
The language comments you make in your book indicate to me a grave concern you have about the problems of bilingualism. But I was also intrigued to read the section you had about how in parts of the United States there was a big pressure to have German become the second language before World War I, and that World War I pretty well killed that off. But
well, yeah, it ran on beyond. I took German in Watkins in the grade school there.
Minnesota.
Parochial school. That was in the late 20s.
Mm-hmm.
They discontinued it when I was in the 4th grade. I was always sorry. I could write German script.
Oh.
But you know, the main teaching was the only course there was one course in German. But they used to run it all through the 8th grade. But even in the 4th grade, we were reading German and writing German script.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, the Germans were assimilated, but the bilingual multiculturalism is. I spent about 5 years trying to teach people to read English, and that's pretty tough. So when you introduce bilingualism and multilingualism, you get into a serious area of deep confusion.
Mm-hmm. You know. In reading the book, I wasn't absolutely sure that you thought that the bilingual thrust for Spanish was bad, although the critics have said that you came down very hard on that.
Well, I did on that because I was in Congress when we passed the first bilingual education, and the whole thrust was we were going to hire people who knew Spanish, but the thrust was to teach them really to read English and think in English. And they progressively moved it to a point where court decision and some changes in the law that they always had a right to have their whole education in Spanish. And then the printing of ballots in foreign languages. And there have even been cases where lawyers have argued that this was a Hispanic case, was that you couldn't really try them in English. So you'd have to have a separate system of justice, which was in Spanish in order to provide proper justice.
This was the idea they didn't know what was going on?
That they, yeah, we used to say in Watkins that people sinned in English and confessed in German and were absolved in Latin. It was a kind of a trilingual system, but it was a question of progressively being less responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think this is the case with the Hispanics are the principal problems.
Mm-hmm. So you say in effect that the bilingual thrust was something to help them understand what they should be taught by teaching it to them in a certain language until they assimilated
That's
and
right.
became common in the English
So
language.
they could participate in our judicial system, for example, or our political system more effectively. And it's not just, you know, current, but it's people who really know language. Like Yeats, for example, said he thought he could understand the myths of all nations. He could understand Troy, and he said, I realized it was too much. He said, I had to go back and just try to figure out what the Irish was about. And he didn't do it in Irish language. He never did learn it. He did his thinking in English.
I see. Let me jump to the back of the book when in your what's called an afterword, you compared the 1992 United States, which is when this book was written, with second century Rome, and it was a rather glaring comparison, and it kind of frightened me. What comments have you had since Clinton has become president now, 2 years later? Do you still see those same comparisons?
Oh, I think the problems are still the same, that they really haven't, I think if they don't seem to understand that it is a colonial situation. They didn't understand the limits of power back in 69 or 70, and if you don't really have a fairly decent comprehension of the bigger movements, why your particular decisions, it seems to me, are inadequate. And I have seen very little evidence, excepting Clinton has moved on a little bit on immigration, that any of the 5 or 4 major things I addressed have really either been defined or has anything been done about them of any consequence. Of course, you know my position on electing governors president.
No, I don't, so you'll tell us.
Well, I wrote this in '88. Well, I didn't have Clinton in mind, but I had Carter on the record. But we used to say in the Senate, if you elected a governor to the Senate, it took him about 6 years to get over it. So that up until now, Clinton is sort of, I think the foreign policy thing is sort of catch as can catch, but the domestic thing, he's operating almost as though he'd been elected governor of the United States. And it'll take him a few years to get over it.
Well, that's an interesting comparison, and I thank you for it. I'd like to thank you for being with us, Senator McCarthy.
Well,
and I had hoped to get into the third-party issue, but maybe we can discuss that on another interview.
It's deserving of attention, I think.
Yes, it is. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us tonight.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency.